Welcome. You are watching episode 77 of Regional Wrap, part one of a two-part interview recorded on Saturday, 21st of January, 2023. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Far North Queensland, still stubbornly growing, part one, is my guest, Cairns economist Bill Cummings. Bill is the principal of Cummings Economics and Compass Research and has been providing government agencies, regional councils, private industry and entrepreneurs with invaluable market research and assessments of their business case for more than 40 years. He has served on numerous boards and committees over the years, including the Deputy Chairman of the North Australian Development Council and on the Council of James Cook University, North Queensland. Welcome, Bill. Before we get into the serious business about Far North Queensland and its economic value to Queensland and to Australia as a whole, and not only just North Queensland, but Far North Queensland, but North Queensland itself, together with Central Queensland, and basically with the help of Western Australia's iron ore, we basically support the whole nation. Being a Cairns boy yourself, could you give us a bit of background? Because although, like most people of your generation who grew up in Cairns, you would have had to leave the area to get a good formal education. So if we can just start there.
Yes, Bill. In fact, I've often remarked that by the time I was 21, I had done 26,000 miles of rail travel because I was born in 1939, at the beginning of the war, and because of the disruption of the war and my father being overseas for the first 6 years of my life and not at home, we moved around a lot. We moved down to Sydney, we moved down to New England at one stage because the troops were there. And so just even by the time I went to school, I'd done a number of thousand miles of rail travel. And then in those days, I went to school at Gordon Vale State School, Cairns North, Cairns High School. And but to become a corporal in the school cadets, you had to do the 1,043-mile rail trip down to Brisbane and back again to do the course and to qualify. So I went to a Scout Jamboree in Sydney back in about 1952. And then, of course, I went to university in Brisbane. And so between all that, by the time I was 21, I'd done 26,000 miles of rail travel.
But in those days, rail travel would have been a bit like cattle class, wouldn't it, these days?
Well, certainly in the early parts after the war, it was still steam trains, and you'd get in the train in Cairns and you'd arrive in Brisbane blackened from the coal dust, and had a battle. You had to be careful putting your head out the window because you get coal dust in your eyes. And it would take 48 hours to Brisbane. I think it's about 24, 26 now. But there was a big revolution during the 50s with the introduction of the air-conditioned trains. The Sunlander came on the route, and of course they were much more comfortable. However, it was part of growing up in Cairns that you became a very experienced rail traveller. And of course, there was all the hijinks of young people on trains and pulling up with floods and being stuck in places for a day or so while the floods went down and the railway line cleared. So that was all very much part of life.
Well, if we can just move on. So you did your high school years here, but then how did the decision become about in regards to your further education? Was it a sort of a toss-up whether you were going to go to university or get a job just in Cairns, or what was the push from your parents to go and get the university qualifications?
Bill, the education standard was high. In fact, I wrote a thing for the high school a few years ago where I said, when I finally went down to Canberra after university, I was mixing with people from all over Australia, people who had good educations in Sydney and Melbourne and Perth and so forth. And I said I never felt that I'd had a poor education or a disadvantaged education as far as the teaching went. And in fact, I felt I'd done better in that I'd had more activities like school cadets and scouts and athletics and ability to participate in, or opportunity to participate in a whole range of activities that might have been more closed in bigger schools and so forth.
But the fact is, in those days there was no JC, no Central Queensland University, so you had to head off for your university education.
Oh yes, yes, of course, and of course the nearest was Brisbane, and of course subsequently, of course, it gave me pleasure to do the cases for establishing university education in Cairns. However, as far as my background goes, of course, my family have been in the region right from the beginning, and with people who are tin miners up at Irvine Bank, and saddlers in Cairns, and packers taking the shipments from the head of the inlet up to the mineral fields and so forth. So I grew up with a deep appreciation of the structure of the region, the history of the region, and but also because my father was heavily involved in the war, and landed up travelling to England with the 7th Division just after Dunkirk, then fought through the Syrian campaign, and then Papua New Guinea, and up into the landings in Borneo. I grew up in an atmosphere of very much awareness of history, geography, and what was happening in the world. Including sort of my father coming home with a trunk full of materials and souvenirs from different parts of the world. So I really had an advantage of growing up with a fairly global view of things. And of course, as soon as I went south, to cadet camps and university and that sort of thing, I was very much aware of but the differences of the environment in the north, and which also gave me a better appreciation of geography and history and that sort of thing.
So what made you fall into the economics world and with your studies?
Actually, Bill, it was assumed that I would go on and go to Duntroon and have a career in the army like my father. However, that wasn't to be, and in fact, I went to university to start with to do an engineering degree because my maths were always very good at school. And however, a friend of mine who was doing commerce had an economics textbook by a fellow called Samuelson, an American. And I had a look. I was a bit undecided as to what I was going to do, but I was looking through this book, Samuelson's economics textbook, and the light came that that's what I want to do. Was economics. It was something that I was much more interested in than anything else, and particularly because of the there's a lot of history, geography, and but also mathematics involved in economics. So I embarked on an economics degree, a very fundamental one, of economics 1, 2, and 3. I did accounting 1, 2, and 3, and in fact, if I'd wished, just by doing some of the law subjects, I could have been a qualified accountant. But we also did things like public finance and international economics. When I subsequently went through to Canberra, I also did some extra studies that were made easy by the Commonwealth Public Service in agricultural economics and philosophy and a few other things. So I had a fairly broad-based degree. Oh yes, importantly, for my future career, I also, because of the maths background, I did pure maths 1, statistics and statistical mathematics, which gave me a very good grounding in that field, that some of which I was able to use later in life, particularly to get into market research. Anyway, I graduated from the University of Queensland, and however, to get through university, my parents weren't over-endowed with funds, and I worked in one holidays picking tobacco and grading tobacco up at Mareeba. I had an uncle who was a chemist at Gordonvale and worked as a clerk there. I did national service in those days. The national service was still on. At one stage, I drove a fruit van for a lady in Brisbane who sold fruit and vegetables around the streets of Brisbane. So yeah, there's a bit of diversity of experience in jobs. Oh, that's right. I worked in a ply factory in Cairns, the veneer factory in Cairns, in the gap between high school and university.
Well, when you headed off to Canberra, Bill, at that stage, it would have still been a lot like a sheep paddock, wouldn't it?
Yes, Bill, it has expanded quite dramatically since then. It was basically just the core part. The lake had not been built, Lake Burley Griffin. Of course, the memorial was in place. The Parliament House was in place with the parliamentary triangle, but it was the old Parliament House. Actually, when I arrived there, however, it was no great stranger to me, because my elder brother, Clem, had been through Duntroon, but had spent a short time in the army, but then got out and did architecture. And he'd married a Canberra girl, and they were in Canberra. So I was not a complete stranger there, and able to settle in fairly well. Lived in a hostel for a while. It was quite an experience to live in Canberra in a fibro hostel with a one-bar heater during the winter months, and have the experience of you kept your shoes on all day, and your shoes and socks, compared to Queensland. So I was able to adjust fairly quickly into Canberra. I got a job with the Department of Trade in the tariff policy section, which was important, and doing research work as a research officer, and got an appreciation of, one of the mainstreams of economic policy at that stage was protectionism. And I stayed there for 2 years, and then I got the opportunity to get a job with the Australian Chamber of Commerce, which had a secretariat in Canberra. The Chamber of Commerce really representing the capital city chambers around Australia. And I went there as their first research officer. And that in itself was a great experience for me. because suddenly I was pitched right in the middle of Canberra, with contacts with Parliament House, with contacts with the diplomatic corps, commercial people, with contacts with the media, and of course with contacts with the business community through all the meetings. I was appointed as to do tariff work for what was called the Australian Wholesale Soft Goods Federation, which was the textile wholesalers, and that often took me to Sydney and Melbourne, and I presented a case to the tariff board against hiking the tariffs on cotton textiles, and we did man-made fibres. They also got me to be secretary of the Australian Chamber of Commerce Export Council. So I stayed with the chamber for 5 years, and I could have stayed there indefinitely. However, I decided to come back to the north. I must say that I had some political ambitions in mind at the time, and but I applied for a job as a lecturer with James Cook University, but the job that I was able to get at the time was as manager of the Ingham District Research and Promotion Bureau. So I plunged back into Northern Queensland, right in the cane fields level, and I've mainly engaged in promoting agricultural diversification, the development of roads into the hinterland. But then we're into the early 1970s, and tourism was starting to appear as a prime prospect for the north at that stage, and I was piggy in the middle between Cairns and Townsville, and there was a report done by Australian National Travel Association on the tourism potential of the north, and as a result of that, the North Queensland Travel Council was formed to promote the north, and I landed up as secretary and started organising some of the tourist promotions. The Far North Queensland Development Bureau had been formed at that stage and had just formed a board for tourism and travel, and I was invited to come up to Cairns to manage that. The Development Bureau brought together all the local authorities in the area, and were pooling their money, and the business community in the area. And so I managed that organisation for 8 years then. And importantly in that was the real start of professional tourism promotion of the region. And I was heavily involved in that. But also at that time we were promoting trade with Papua New Guinea. We were promoting agricultural development. I administered the industrial estates in the region, and with that linkage with the State Department of Industrial Development. Now I was there 8 years, and then it was a fairly stressful sort of job. We had the big arguments about setting up the airport and that sort of thing. And but then in 1982, I decided to set up my own business as a consultant in economic research and subsequently market research, which I've subsequently done since then continuously. The Chamber of Commerce came to me then, and they asked me to look after the Secretariat of the Chamber of Commerce, which I did then from 1982 through to about 1998, where the Chamber got to a point it could employ its own staff. And but then I've served on all sorts of boards and committees, and of course been through the market research, been into all sorts of fields. And on the economic side, I've done work right across the north, up into Papua New Guinea. I was even invited at one stage to go up and the Republic of Palau near Guam had just got its independence and asked me to come up to help them with the programs following independence. And I went up to talk about chambers of commerce and business development and so forth. During that period, also, of course, I got very heavily involved in major issues of the establishing the university campus in Cairns. At one stage there, we had an attempt to get a television license in the area, but didn't succeed, and an independent international university. So you name it, I've been involved in it somewhere along the way.
Had a finger in the pie.
Yes.
So now, basically, so for the last 40 years, you've been in your own business and that, but you've also would have had an oversight of what's transpired in Cairns. What do you think are some of the key factors that sort of kicked the ball along for Cairns? Was it the things like the airport, SCASE coming in with the investment, other sort of industrial events? I mean, one of the things that would have hurt the area a lot was the anti-tobacco sort of thing that would have hurt parts of the agriculture. But then you would have seen other areas flourished. Can you just touch on some of maybe the core events that sort of helped Cairns along?
Bill, perhaps as an introduction to this, I'll just talk about the North in general and where it was situated, and the economic development strategies that have been considered over the years and so forth. I came back north in 1968, and at that stage, there was an organisation called People of the North Committee that was generally advocating for an increase in population in the north and development. There had been development bureaus set up in Rockhampton and Bowen. Of course, I came back to look after one in Ingham. And of course, there was the Far North Queensland Development Bureau set up in Cairns. But there was a basic issue at the time when I was with the Chamber of Commerce in Canberra. We used to write a short journal each month called Canberra Comments, and I did a story at that stage on the theories of a fellow called Neutz, Max Neutz, and he was advocating for regional development in Australia, that we should select the potential growth points that could be artificially built up to compete with the metropolitan centres. And I wrote an article about it, and there was some appeal of it because decentralisation and regional development has been an issue in Australia for a long time. And I wrote an article sort of setting out, some of the appeal of that theory of regional development, of growth centres. And however, when I came back north and really had a look at the north, of course, the north was relatively underdeveloped, well, very underdeveloped compared to southern Australia. And when I looked at the north, I came to the conclusion that its cities weren't that big, not because there had been attempts to set up manufacturing or attempts to develop urban services. The basic fact was that the natural resources of the north had not been developed anywhere near southern Australia, and that the cities that what was important was to develop that natural resource base or the natural attributes of the area. And if you did that, the cities would grow. And so it was really turning the growth centre theory on its head. to meet the circumstances in the north, that we had to concentrate on basics. Now, at that stage in Australia, there was a great deal of emphasis on trying to get up manufacturing. I concluded that, as far as the north goes, we were too far off centre, too weak in population to support certainly manufacturing aimed at a national market or even a state market, and that the opportunities open to us was not in that sort of field. And what I was really looking at in Ingham, and then when I came up to Cairns, there was things like agricultural production, the cattle industry getting up, but also emerging, particularly in the Cairns region, a major opportunity to grow tourism. And the tourism at that stage was sunrise industry. People's income was going up. Transport was improving. The natural tourism attractions of Cairns had been there all the time. And people used to come up on the railway train, the Sunshine Express, to see the rainforests and the reef and that sort of thing. And on the cruise ships, the Manura coming up the coast. However, in the post-war period, there was the boom in car transport, the family car, and buses, coaches, and the roads were improving. The final sealing of the link between Brisbane and Cairns went in 1972 in the Marlborough Arena stretch. Before then, there'd been that long unsealed distance and the road was pretty crook. But people were starting to make their way north by car. And so that there was quite a strong rise in tourism. And in the area, when we got into it with the Board for Tourism and Travel and the Promotion Bureau, we did things like set up information centres. And then we also, at that stage, aircraft, air transport was coming to the fore for tourism. And I've often said that you can write the whole history of tourism in this region in terms of transport improvements, you know, from the rail link, the cruise ships coming up, the Manura and so forth, then through to the family car, and then through to airports. And of course, one of the big things during the 70s was to get Cairns Airport upgraded to you know, take the modern aircraft, but also to international tourism was starting to develop into Australia. I attended an Australian Chamber of Commerce annual conference in Hobart in the 60s when a fellow Atkinson from the Australian Tourism Commission came along and talked about how these jumbo jets were going to revolutionise tourism to Australia. Anyway, that was a big challenge to take advantage of all that. And we set up doing promotions into Sydney and Melbourne, but eventually we were able to push through the upgrading of the airport to take long wide-body jets direct from overseas, with the first routes, of course, being Hawaii, which subsequently disappeared, but the most important one was the development of the Japan route. Anyway, but tourism is really a resource-based industry. The tourism along the coast really depends upon access to the reef and rainforest and tourist attractions on the land, and of course the Far North Queensland region, along with the Whitsunday region, had the goods. However, the emphasis was for the Cairns region on developing those things that we could, including you know, tea started to be grown and coffee and and that sort of thing, and where we could get mining up. And of course, one of the big things that came in during the 60s and 70s was the discovery of all the prawns in the Gulf. And it was like a gold rush around there for a while in the 70s, with boats steaming around there to take advantage of it. Weipa came in. It wasn't discovered until the 50s, and Weipa got developed. And the combination of all those things saw Cairns lifting, particularly with the tourism side coming through. So I've always been, very much basics. Now, of course, then you take your opportunities to develop your city services, and we promoted industrial estates in the region and that sort of thing. And then when the population got big enough, we were able to start moving then on advocating and getting a university campus set up in the region. But the strategic priority was the basics, and that's where we went ahead. Townsville, on the other hand, at that stage tended to concentrate on what it saw as its capital city role, and of course it had had a big boost during the 60s with the location of the army base, and Townsville had been pushed along by the Mount Isa development in the post-war period, and was riding very high during the 60s. And there was a bit of a fear in Cairns at that stage that Cairns would get left behind. But it saw its big opportunity, particularly in tourism, which was fairly basic. So, however, over the years, it's been as the city has grown, as its earnings from the rest of the world have increased, the city has prospered and grown very strongly. In 1947, in my childhood, the census of Cairns City Council area was 16,000. Cairns Regional Council now is pushing 170,000. Mind you, at that stage there was some population in Mulgrave Shire surrounding the city, but it was still fairly small. And so we've had a tremendous growth. The part of that also has been linkages up with Papua New Guinea, and we've had various missions up there at the time to promote the development of shipping and transport, etc.
But there's sort of rivalry between Townsville and Cairns. Do you think that rivalry is helpful or detrimental to both parties?
Bill, you've really got to understand the structure of the North economy, and the fact that going back in time, it was very small in population and industry, and what has developed over time is that in the very early days in the North, the pastoral industry was the dominating factor, and railway lines were built, and the big pastoral area, in fact, was the sheep area, the wool area in the central west, the Walsing Matilda country. And the dominant thrust in those very early days was the establishment of Rockhampton as a port, Townsville as a port, and the building of railway lines into that pastoral country. Of course, with Townsville, that was followed through to a linkage to the Mount Isa mineral fields. And for Rockhampton, of course, you had Mount Morgan. The development of farming and agriculture was relatively slow to develop. And certainly back in those days, there's no such thing as tourism. there were fisheries, and of course that tended to orient always to the Cairns region. The north really developed into a structure of central Queensland and North Queensland, with Rockhampton as a capital of central Queensland and Townsville as a capital of North Queensland, but with sub-centres then further north for Rockhampton in Mackay, and for Townsville in the Cairns region. Now, over the years, a lot of the development of the north has been due to an economy that was basically dependent on people and technology that had come from northwestern Europe. The north and the tropical area posed a much greater challenge than southern Australia, and however, over the years, what has tended to happen is that with the agriculture has come through, it's mainly been in the Mackay region, but especially in the Cairns region. The tourism has tended to orient to the Cairns region and the Mackay region, and the fisheries, of course, far north Queensland has always dominated, starting off with the pearling and crocus and coming through to the prawns and the other fisheries in the region. Now, the other thing you've got to appreciate is the size of the area. If you overlay central and northern Queensland from the New South Wales border southwards, it virtually covers all of New South Wales, all of Victoria, Tasmania, and even some parts of South Australia. So these are big regions, and what's tended to develop, the realities of areas and distances, have led to the formation of a number of discrete regions. And these regions are, in fact, virtually state size. The smallest region, the Mackay region, is about the same size as Tasmania. The far north Queensland region, or based on Cairns, is 1.5 times the size of Victoria and as deep as New South Wales. So that's the realities of areas and distances. However, while populations were and development was lower, the Rockhampton and Townsville tended to dominate. And however, a lot of the subsequent development has taken place in the Cairns and Mackay regions for very good reasons, and of course, those sheer sizes of the regions really required, the economics were such that we landed up with 4 little capital cities. And and I think Mackay these days has now passed Rockhampton in size. Cairns, from being half the size, is pushing on Townsville in size. And of course, the Cairns region. The other factor was the further north you went, the more the tropical factor came in. That technology and not just in the industries, particularly in agriculture, but in everyday living, needed to be developed. But the further north you went, the heavier that tropical factor was. And so what tended to happen is that the Mackay and Cairns region have grown up, and the northern regions, the further north the region, the stronger the development. So the strongest growing over the last 40, 50 years has been the far north Queensland region, followed by the Mackay region, then the Townsville region has outgrown central Queensland region. And so from that 2-region structure, you've tended to consolidate into a 4-region structure. Now, of course, for instance, take university. Townsville and Rockhampton as the old larger cities. The universities were started there, but then it's been a battle for the Cairns region to get university development up because of a reluctance of Townsville to let a part of the student body go, and and still today Cairns is still short for its size on university development. And of course there was a scrap over when international upgrading the airport. There was a fair bit of resistance in Townsville to Cairns Airport being upgraded, but of course it was Cairns where the international tourists want to go, where the tourists want to go, and it's this old growth centre argument coming up, whether you should be just concentrating on one spot or whether you should have your facilities and so forth to develop your total economic base. So yes, there has been rivalry and so forth at the time. The government, of course, is partly responsible for this because they're reluctant to put facilities outside of Brisbane at times, and they want to just put one outside of Brisbane, and they'll select Townsville, or they'll select Cairns, or they'll select Rockhampton, etc. But you need to see it all against that
to another part of the conversation.
Sorry?
I suppose it brings us to another part of the conversation in regards to the contribution of Central and North Queensland to the Queensland economy and
yes,
the Australian economy overall, in comparison with the what would you say, the strategic planning of Brisbane to actually put in infrastructure for wealth creation outside of Brisbane.
Well,
there is,
Bill, I'll just talk about the North and its contribution generally to the Australian economy and to the Queensland economy. The North's got about 5% of Australia's population. It used to be 4%, so it's come up. However, these days, in terms of export earnings for Australia, Northern Australia now accounts for over 50%. I think it worked out at about 57% of Australia's merchandise exports. That doesn't include service exports, but that's the basics of the economy. So the bulk, it can be said, and I've written an article on this, that going back in the 50s and 40s and so forth, Australian economy used to be described as riding on the sheep's back. And if you looked at the statistics at the time, pastoral industry exports, particularly wool, was accounting for over 50% of Australia's exports back at that time. Today, the reality is that Northern Australia, so from central Queensland north and Northern Territory and from the Pilbara region north, is accounting for 57% of the last figures was 57% of Australia's export earnings. So it makes a massive contribution to sustaining the Australian economy. If you didn't have those exports, the Australian dollar would fall through the floor. If you didn't have the exports from the north. That's
one thing a lot of people don't understand is the difference between an economy and internal economy,
yes.
and part of the economy that draws in foreign exchange and how important it is to every nation, but Australia in particular. And I don't think enough people have got a grip on how much we are dependent on coal and iron ore to deliver us that export dollars coming in to basically prop up everything.
Yes, Bill. I when I was in Canberra in the 60s, there was tremendous concern about Australia's balance of payments, that how we were going to keep up growth of Australia because of where the exports were going to come from. And in fact, at one stage there in the early 60s, Australia even introduced import licensing to try and curtail the amount of imports coming in, and which was bad economics and and administratively very difficult. And of course, there was even a national economic inquiry at the time that went into this problem, and it came out with recommendations that would have been brought in a whole lot of constraints in relation to things like imports and so forth. However, the Treasury at the time, and particularly a friend of mine, John Stone, who subsequently became Secretary of the Treasury, he wrote a paper and he said, and with some insight, he originally came from Western Australia. He said he said with some insight that there'd been a book written at that time about Australia, the lucky country, and he said in the lucky country things turn up, and we shouldn't worry too much about it, and they did, but they mainly turned up in the north. There had been worries about Australia's iron ore resources being very low. Lang Hancock knew differently from his cattle station in Western Australia, and as soon as some restraints were pulled off, our iron ore exports boomed. And the coal's been under central Queensland forever. It's been known about, but with the Japanese economy roaring along in the post-war period, an opportunity came there to develop the export of coal out of Queensland. In Western Australia, that was followed by the gas offshore, and in Queensland, the bauxite came in at Weipa. There was bauxite at Gove, the north came in other fields. However, so the north and this tremendous development of exports out of the north has carried the Australian economy through, because as I say, if you don't have those exports, you can't import, and an Australian economy would be very inefficient if it tried to supply all its own needs. Our living standards would be much, much lower than they are today. So the North coming through with all that export income it really underpins Australia's standard of living. And it underpins the Commonwealth budget.
But one of the things is that's all well and good, digging holes and pulling down mountains and exporting, but there's been very little focus on at least getting it to the value-added stage. I mean, it beggars belief. Here we are. I mean, it was in the 60s that the iron ore got off in Western Australia, and at the same time that we're shipping more iron ore and that, we let our steel industry fall apart rather than sort of capitalising on our own internal wealth. And then we've got bauxite by the bucket loads, and we're not even thinking about putting in more smelters or things like that, or getting the secondary industry running up.
Yes.
And by the bucket loads, 80% of the rainfall on mainland Australia is in the north, and we virtually do nothing to capture it, and also make money, through opening up agriculture, opening up other sort of interests. And we've had the Ord River project that's sort of undercapitalised, but it does give us a bit of a proof of concept what you can do with damming rivers and improving things in said areas, and that could be done in other areas in the north, but it's just not on the radar at all for either Brisbane or Canberra. Although we have a lot of rhetoric about developing Northern Australia, there's no reality to it.
Yeah, Bill, I'll just comment on a couple of points here. I just did some work in relation to the silica sand deposits up the Cape. They're trying to get a new silica sand mine operating at Hopevale, and it's run through my mind that here we are shipping it all off to China to make solar panels and so forth. But of course, it would be great if we could make the solar panels here in the north, particularly because the other major ingredient is electricity, and we seem intent on pricing ourselves out of the electricity market compared to America and China, etc.
Thanks, Bill. That's the end of part 1, but we'll be returning next week with part 2. So again, thank you, Bill, and join us again next week, of course. But until then, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.